you're helping us to continue our unique tradition of penny lectures. This is our 125th year, and 125 years ago, penny lectures were developed to debate issues of the day, encourage new ideas, be provocative, and they were such a success that they quickly developed into evening classes and what is now Morley College. It's also worth remembering that they were inspired by the radical movements of the 19th century and the idea that education transformed lives and that it was a powerful leveller of people. Equality and diversity is core to the values of Morley College, and we know that over the last 30 years a lot of strides have been made in the equality agenda in this country and across the world. It's interesting when we reflect on those strides that actually gender equality and women's equality has been at a bit of a standstill, I believe, and in some areas there's been regression, and particularly at this point in time with public spending cuts, which are going to cut impact on women disproportionately. Welfare reforms push women into poverty, and we know that there's a lot of discrimination in the labour market for women. And there's also underrepresentation for women in politics and decision making. So we know that despite the progress, lots of struggles continue and campaigns continue. History also tells us that progress often comes as the result of the work of individuals, people who are courageous, who are prepared to stand up and for their voices to be heard. Criado-Perez, I hope I pronounced that correctly, I believe is one of these women. She's a journalist and a feminist activist, and I am delighted to welcome her to Morley College this evening. I'm going to leave Caroline to tell you herself about what has motivated her and about her work in relation to women's equality. Thank you very much, Caroline.
Okay. Hello. So what I'm going to do is run quite quickly, because we have an hour, but actually that's not very much time to talk about everything that I want to talk about, which is, the whole world really. And I want to sort of focus on what sometimes gets dismissed as quite a trivial issue, which is the representation of women. And I actually think that it needs to be a fundamental part of feminism in the 21st century. But first of all, I just want to start off with some stats on how we're doing more generally with equality today for women. I hope I'm pressing in the right direction. Yes, I am. So you can guess what that's about. So from the 7th of November every year, women in the UK essentially work for free. That's how big our gender pay gap is. And bear in mind that this is a country where it's been illegal to pay women less than men for over 40 years. So there's obviously something going on there. And I think that people often talk about how we're equal now based on the legislation. Well, we've got this legislation, but we still don't have equal pay, so there's got to be something else going on there. Women make up 70% of the 2 billion people around the world who live in poverty, 70%, and we're 50% of the population, so why is it that more of us are poor than men are? And that is a figure that is deeply connected to the way in which many women are prevented from accessing education, with 2/3 of those who are illiterate globally being women, and that is Malala Yousafzai, who I'm sure you've all heard of, who campaigned for girls to be allowed education in Pakistan and was shot in the head by the Taliban, and she's still an incredibly inspirational woman and has carried on campaigning. Last year, the World Health Organization declared violence against women a global health problem of epidemic proportions. And I'm sure you appreciate that for an organisation called the World Health Organization, they don't use the term epidemic lightly. And there's no surprise, really, that they use that term, because the stats are shocking. 1 out of 3 women globally will be affected by violence against women. This clicker is... Where am I pointing the clicker? Because it doesn't really seem to... Who's in charge of the clicker? Me. Okay. I'm going to try pointing it at different places and see what happens. 1 out of 4 women will have experienced sexual violence. A woman is abused by her partner an average of 35 times before she will call the police. And yet the police receive an average of a call every single minute to report domestic violence. Just sort of think about that for a second. They get a call every minute, but a woman will have been abused 35 times on average before she'll actually make that call. So there's a lot of domestic violence that actually is going unreported. Women make up 89% of all those who have experienced 4 or more incidents of domestic violence. And according to research by Karen Ingala Smith, who is a feminist campaigner, and she heads up an organisation called NIA, which is campaigns against violence against women, she's been counting all the women who've been killed by men in the UK for the past 3 years. The reason she's doing this work is because the government doesn't seem to think that this is data worth collecting. She's found that a woman is killed by a man every 2.38 days in the UK. Last year, between April and September, 3 women were beheaded by men in London alone. And I'm sure you all heard about the terrible beheadings that happened in the desert by ISIS. But I'm sure, well, I imagine fewer of you will have heard about the 3 beheadings that happened in 6 months in this capital city. And again, it's worth reflecting on why it is that we haven't heard, that we hear about some beheadings and not others. So all this makes violence against women the #1 cause of violent death for women. So why is all this happening? What's going on? Well, I want to take you on a bit of a history lesson now on sort of how we've sort of historically seen women and see if we can find any links there and any roots to what's going on. So I really like this quotation. I don't know how you feel about it. I find it quite funny. This is from the 2nd century, St. Clement, a famous lover of women. So, I mean, shaming of women has a really long pedigree, and like other forms of shaming, it's really about social control. But what's interesting about the form that it takes when it's about women is that it's about taking away a woman's autonomy and particularly focusing on any desire that she might have. Because for a woman to have desire suggests that she's a little bit too independent, and that's quite worrying. So they make it shameful for women to desire anything, and that can be anything from food to sex to power to having a voice. So let's have a look at history of women's shaming through the ages. So this is the witches. These are some witches who have been burnt at the stake. And what's interesting, interesting is not a very good word when we're talking about women being burnt at the stake, but what I find telling, I guess, about the witch hunts is the type of woman who is most likely to be accused of being a witch. And it was mainly widows, spinsters, or midwives. So why might that be? Well, widows, they were very dangerous because not only had they escaped the clutches of their father, they'd also escaped the clutches of their husband. So there were these autonomous women going around potentially having these terrible sexual desires and leading men down the wayward path towards having orgies with the devil, apparently. So that's what widows do. And spinsters, similarly, they're still kind of under control of their father, but they've never been controlled by a husband. And there was this great fear of women's sexuality. So these women were very concerning, and midwives were particularly concerning, because, and again this is kind of linked to sex, because the fear about midwives was that they could potentially ease women's labour pains. So that leads to women having sex and then not being punished for it by having labour pains, which is shocking. Even more shockingly, they might have been able to help women have access to abortions, to abort the fetus, and again, that's even more consequence-free sex for women, which we'd obviously never do. So that's kind of what was going on with the witches. It was this fear of women's sexuality and a desire to control it and to shame women into not displaying any sexual desire, so they wouldn't be accused of being witches. Similarly, there was a focus on women's voices, and women's ability to communicate. So women who were gossiping, there was this fear of women's autonomy in terms of gossip, because gossip is what women do when they get together and men aren't there, and God knows what they might be saying. They might be spreading all kinds of scurrilous things about. Again, with midwives, there was the sense that they were educated and they could communicate. And interestingly is not a great term, but anyway, when these public burnings happened, they would often gag the women or cut out their tongues so that they couldn't speak to the crowd, because there was this huge concern about women's voices. So there you go, that's witches. This is the Scold's Bridle, and this is very specifically aimed at controlling women's voices, so any woman who was considered to be a nag or a scold. Again, also women who gossiped too much, it was sometimes called the Gossip's Bridle. They would be paraded through the town wearing this device, and I'll show you some, that's a pretty scary one. That one has a bell on it, so that was to draw extra attention and really bringing in the shaming element here of this terrible woman who dared to use her voice. So these bridles would have a mouth bit, and it would clamp down the tongue, and often there would be a spike on it as well, so that if the woman did try and speak, her tongue would be lacerated. So this was a combination of shutting her up and shaming her for having dared to use her voice in a very violent way. So again, there's this focus on shutting women up and not allowing them to have the desire to express themselves or have any autonomy. Similarly, this is again looking at sexuality. This was a chair that was in a cage that could be rotated and put in the public square, and prostitutes were put in it and shamed for having led men down the wayward path towards sex. And obviously, you know, presumably you would think some of the men who had paid for sex would be there shaming the woman whom they had paid for sex, and no one really seemed to think that there was anything odd about that. Next up, head shaving. So this is, you can see all the people around are having a really lovely time. This is of a woman in France after the liberation of France. So women who were accused of collaboration horizontale, so sleeping with German soldiers during the occupation, had their heads shaved. And interestingly in France, that also took place. There was two waves of it. One was immediately after the liberation, and one was a little bit later, which was after concentration camp victims came home and prisoner of war victims came home. And the reason I think that's kind of interesting is because it suggests that there's this sort of sense of the way in which masculinity and femininity are defined, that masculinity needs to be about dominating women and asserting your power and control and dominance. And so these men who had been victims and had been humiliated felt the need to come back and do this to their women. And it's been going on for a really long time. It was a punishment for adultery for women in biblical times, although it wasn't for men, because men can be adulterous and that's fine. It also took place during the French occupation of the Rhineland in 1923. German women who slept with French men had their heads shaved. Similarly, any woman who slept with a non-Aryan under the Third Reich would have her head shaved. And these women were then paraded around on lorries around the town so everyone could see their shame. And this is in Belgium. These women were feathered and tarred and had their heads shaved, and as you can see, forced to do the Heil Hitler sign as a result of having been accused of sleeping with German soldiers. Interestingly as well, women could be accused of having slept with German soldiers just for having an abortion. It was assumed that the only reason you'd want to have an abortion was because you'd slept with a German soldier. So yeah, I think that's sort of interesting in connection to what I was saying about midwives being accused of being witches. And as you can see, it's not actually that long ago still. This was in 1971. A woman who was accused by the IRA of sleeping with a soldier was feathered and tarred and strung to a lamppost. Now some more modern day ones. So you can see it's still going on. And as I said, women's desires, any kind of female desire, is seen as shameful. So this is women who eat on tubes. As far as I'm aware, as far as I've been able to find, there is no corresponding one for men, no men who eat on tubes, because men can eat without it being a disgusting act. I mean, that's kind of self-explanatory, really. This is just, you know, women shouldn't want to eat. This is a pretty horrific example of the type of shaming that happens towards women. So I don't know if you know about the Steubenville rape case. Basically what happened was a girl went to some frat parties, got very, very drunk, and didn't know what was happening to her. And what was happening to her was that she was being sexually assaulted, and it was being filmed. And she was being sexually assaulted by numerous members of a football team. And their friends filmed it and took photos of it and then posted it on the internet. and she was called a slut and a whore. And as you can see in this comment, this person is saying that we shouldn't feel bad about this rape victim because she's known as the stupid Bill's train whore. So again, it's this idea that if a woman has any kind of desire, then anything can be done to her, anything goes, she deserves everything that's coming to her because she has the audacity to have desire, so therefore she can't really be raped. And somehow, this is one of the men who assaulted her. The dead body that he's talking about is the passed out girl he was assaulting. And yet somehow they are the ones who are being shamed. It was her who was being shamed for having previously had sex and allowing herself somehow to be raped. And I guess being drunk enough that she was able to be raped, suggesting that she desired alcohol and desired a bit of fun. This guy, as you can see, is having a really lovely time. He's getting a blowjob, actually, at an Eminem concert. And the girl who was giving him a blowjob was christened Slain Girl, because that's the place the blowjob took place. She was 17 years old, and again, the photos and the video were posted online. She was eventually admitted into hospital because she was suffering from trauma from being the top trending topic on Twitter. People calling her a vile slut, a whore, a rotten hoe. She deserves everything she gets. And they started making memes of her with captions like "Slain Girl will suck anything" next to a picture of a vacuum. And there was again this general sense that she brought it on herself by being so disgusting and sexual. And the boy has never been named, and the only thing that people ever said about him was that he was a hero, and someone wanted to give him a medal. So that's a really, really stark reminder of the double standards that we still have going on today between men and women. And there are a couple of other examples of this. I mean, there are loads of examples of this. It's just seemingly endless at the moment on the internet. Two examples that I think are particularly worth mentioning. A 14-year-old girl in America who wanted to get back together with her boyfriend, and he said, okay, well, we can get back together, but you have to give me a blowjob. So she did, and not realising that his friends he'd set it up so that his friends were filming the whole thing, and that was put on the internet, and again, she was called a slut and a whore, and they were given high fives. An even more upsetting one was a 15-year-old girl. That girl was 14, I don't know if I said that. This girl was 15. She had sex with 4 football players at a party on the weekend. And the following week at school, she was called, as you will probably imagine by now, a slut and a whore, including by the football players themselves. By Wednesday, she'd thrown herself in front of a train and killed herself. Right. Another example I think is worth mentioning from slightly beforehand is Monica Lewinsky. She was almost, I think, the first example of the way in which the internet has really managed to explode this idea of this ability of people to shame women again in a way that we haven't really seen for a very long time. It's almost like the internet has become the public square that we used to have back in the medieval era where everyone knew everyone, and now you've got this internet persona and millions of people can be hearing about you, knowing about you, and shaming you for your actions. So Monica Lewinsky, the reason I bring this up is just I think it's quite interesting to consider the way in which she's spoken about versus the way in which Bill Clinton is spoken about. He was the one who was actually committing adultery, he was the one who was in a position of power, much older, he was her boss, and was in his 40s or 50s, I can't remember, she was a 21-year-old intern. Anyway, when you search for Monica Lewinsky on Google, the suggested searches that come up are cigar and blue dress, both of which were related to the relationship she had with Bill Clinton. If you search for Bill Clinton, you get Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton diet, Bill Clinton politics, Bill Clinton net worth, Bill Clinton quotes. No mention of Monica Lewinsky. And this is a list of the 20 top jokes made by Jay Leno, who is a presenter in America. And number 1 is Bill Clinton. Well, in fact, all of them, as you can see, are quite sort of political heavyweights. But number 7 is Monica Lewinsky, and the only reason she's there is because she had sex with some guy. this is just something that I found particularly sad. There was a documentary made about her in early 2001, and she talks about this guy asking her, how does it feel to be America's premier blowjob queen? That was about 4 years after the whole thing had happened. So let's move on, because that's just depressing. This is Emma Watson. I like Emma Watson, she's great. However, some other people do not like Emma Watson, and those people happen to be violent misogynists. So you may remember that I think it was last year, nude photos suddenly surfaced of a load of female celebrities, Jennifer Lawrence, Kate Upton, and various other women. And there was a huge scandal about it because obviously these photos had been taken without their consent. I mean, the photos had been taken with their consent by them and sent to their boyfriends or whoever their partners were, but someone had hacked into Apple's infrastructure and managed to get these and put them all up on the internet. Shortly after this, Emma Watson made a very famous speech at the UN, launching a campaign called He for She, which was calling for men to become involved in feminism and female equality. And she says, the minute I stepped up and talked about women's rights, I was immediately threatened. I mean, within less than 12 hours, I was receiving threats. 4chan, which is this sort of anarchic message board, set up a countdown website called Emma You Are Next, and they had a countdown clock, and it said, never forget, the biggest to come thus far, and had a picture of Emma Watson crying. And there were comments like, it's real and going to happen this weekend, that feminist bitch Emma is going to show the world she's as much of a whore as any woman. She makes stupid feminist speeches at the UN and now her news will be online, ha ha ha. So again, just showing that there's this real continuation of this idea that if any woman dares to use her voice, if any woman tries to show any form of independence, she will be shamed by having her sexuality shown to be, in the words of this guy, whorish. And interestingly, this is made by, I guess, quasi-supporters of Emma Watson. Recently she said that she'd always known it was going to be a hoax because she hadn't taken any naked photos of herself. And there's this sort of sense of, well, that's why she got away with it, because she was a good girl. She didn't do anything as vile as take photos of herself and send them to someone, so she deserves to be presented as this angel. And I would suggest that the person who made that meme is no friend to women, because again, it's suggesting that if any woman dares to have any sexual desire, she deserves what's coming to her. And I just want to close that little deviation with one of my favourite quotations, which is a Renaissance proverb, which says, an eloquent woman is never chaste. And I think that really says all we need to know about the connection between women's sexuality and their voices. So anyway, what does this all have to do with the representation of women? Well, this is what happened to me when I stood up and asked for women to be represented on banknotes. I think that one is particularly interesting because it basically clarifies what all of it was about, was that I was a woman who was daring to use her voice and therefore I deserved to get raped. And it's very interesting how soon the rape threats, how soon the threat of violent sex and violent violation comes next to a woman daring to use her voice. Another particularly memorable one was, shut your whore mouth or I'll shut it for you and choke you with my dick. And for me, that just feels very reminiscent of the idea of the scold's bridle, that you're going to be publicly shamed and have your sexuality brought into question by daring to use your voice. So let me just tell you a little bit about what happened. So what happened was that the Bank of England announced that they were going to be releasing a new £5 note. I'm going to take my jacket off because I've suddenly got a cup on. So a new £5 note, which was going to have Winston Churchill on it. And that meant that all the historical figures on the banknotes were going to be of men. And I thought that was a problem because, for various reasons, or really I just thought it was a really stupid idea and it shouldn't have happened. There's no reason that you want to have an all-male lineup representing our cultural history. The Bank of England makes very clear, they sort of talk about how privileged they are to be able to have this wonderful opportunity to demonstrate what our culture has been and what our history has been and what they want our culture and history to be represented by as white men. It suggests that only white men have ever done anything worthy of being represented. So I thought that was a really damaging message and also a really unnecessary message to send out because there are plenty of women that could be chosen. So I decided to start campaigning on it. And to be honest, I didn't really expect it to be a very big campaign. I thought it was such an obvious error that they would just say, oh yeah, fair enough, we'll get that changed straight away. Unfortunately, they didn't. But eventually, after 3 months of hard campaigning, we won, and they not only agreed to put a woman on the next £10 note, they also completely changed their selection procedure, which for me was the much bigger win, because it was about them acknowledging that actually the criteria which they had heralded as objective were in fact not objective and were what was leading them to continue to select white men for their banknotes. But anyway, the day after the announcement came out that the campaign had been successful, I started getting these rape threats and these death threats, and they were very specific and talked about which part of my body would be penetrated by which part of their body, which part of my body would be mutilated. There were people who were trying to track down my address, and it was very clear that these men were trying to hunt me down and wanted to cause extensive damage to me, or at least put me in great fear for my life, which they did. Because it was coming in, every minute for about 3 weeks, and I had no way of knowing who they were, or where they were, or what they were capable of. So, in a way, it worked because they wanted to terrorise me, and they did. But why I think this is relevant to the representation of women in particular is the reasons behind it. And it felt to me like, it was such a ridiculous thing to get rape threats for. I was just asking for a woman on a banknote. It's such a tiny, tiny ask. What was it that was so threatening and so scary for these men that they felt that a woman asking for something like that must be shut down by any means possible? And so the only way I could explain it to myself was that they must be having some kind of existential crisis. And for them, seeing a woman who is talking in the public sphere, and not only talking in the public sphere, agitating for other women, more women, to join her in the public sphere, was really threatening to them and their sense of masculinity. And I think that that's the reason I mentioned the masculinity is because it felt that was a very much a sort of idea of woman, know your place. And if you don't know your place, I'm going to use my penis to put you in your place. So it was very much a male versus female thing. Women who talk too much need to get raped. And so what I felt it was that we have this world in which these men, and I just, I'm not saying it's all men, but they were mostly men who were sending me these threats, we live in a world where masculinity is kind of defined by being dominant and being in the public sphere and having your voice heard. And there will be these, generations of young men still who are brought up and they look at the world around them and they see men. They see men in newspaper columns. They see men as politicians. They see men as their football idols. Everywhere you look, really, in the public sphere, you're much more likely to see a man than a woman. And I think that inevitably leads certain men to grow up thinking, well, that's what it means to be a man, and when I grow up, this is what's going to happen to me, and people are going to listen to me, and it's going to be great. And so then, when you do grow up, and people aren't really listening to you, you're just a bog-standard guy, and then you look in the media, and there's this uppity woman who is talking and being listened to, I think that's really threatening for them, and that is the only explanation I can come up with for why on earth you would send a woman asking for a woman on a banknote a rape threat. But anyway, perhaps you think I'm exaggerating, perhaps you think that, we're all equal now, we've got all this legislation and it's great. After all, there's one man who was very cross with me for campaigning for a woman on a banknote told me, women are everywhere now. But are we everywhere now? Let's find out. So, there are just under 5 men for every woman in Westminster Parliament. It's actually a bit better in Scottish Parliament. What's particularly interesting about that is that there's been a study done on how much women talk in the Scottish Parliament, and even after accounting for the fact that there are more women speak more, which I think shows how much women's speech is limited by sort of social expectations. And once you have sort of enough women there, they're more likely to speak. I find that stat really interesting. Out of 107 High Court judges, only 20 are women. And recently, a Council of Europe report came out showing that only 25% of judges are women, and the UK is third from the bottom on the list, so we're doing really well there. Key Stage 2 of the National History Curriculum features no women at all, and Key Stage 3 only features 4 women, and they're all lumped together under the changing role of women. And by contrast, as you can imagine, men are spread out across their respective fields. So again, when women are represented, we're represented for the fact that we have a vagina, and men are there because they've done something impressive. Right, what's next? Out of 13 editors of a national daily newspaper, only 1 is a woman, and this has actually decreased from a high of 17% a few years ago. So obviously 17% isn't very high, but it's lower now, and I think it's really important to remember that things don't necessarily always get better, and we can't just sort of rest on our laurels and assume that it's all going to be fine. We do need to keep fighting, we do need to keep pushing. 78% of news stories are written by men, so you can probably imagine what this is about. Women don't make front pages. We do when it's pictures like that. We make up 80% of being one of the pretty pictures on the front page that aren't considered relevant to the news story, so they're what's called a lift. So if there's a picture that's not relevant to a news story, there's an 80% chance that it's going to be of a woman, and most likely a very pretty woman. Which is fine, we like pretty women, but maybe some other women could be pictured. Anyway, on any given day, the lead stories have an 84% chance of being about men, and if there's an expert quoted, there's an 80% chance he will be a man. Just like to remind you at this point that women do make up 50% of the population. So some of you might be thinking, well, that's just reflecting the world as it is, and as the world changes, so will the news media. But unfortunately, that's not actually true. So recent research into the UK media has shown, for example, in political news stories, men outnumbered women by 10 to 1. And as I said, in the UK Parliament, it's just under 5 men for every woman. So it's bad, but it's not that bad. So the media is representing it as worse than it actually is. On global news stories that affect women disproportionately more than men, so for example HIV and AIDS, women made up only 42% of news subjects when you'd expect them to make up the majority. And that goes down, bizarrely, I should really look into how this happened because I find it inexplicable. That goes down to 30% if the story is about female electoral candidates. So of the global news media, stories that are about female electoral candidates, only 30% of them had women as the main subject. So that's interesting. Anyway, so the issue of representation isn't always about women being represented too little. Sometimes we're represented too much. So female subjects of global news stories, again, this is about photographs, were more likely to appear in photographs than their male counterparts. Women were also more likely to appear in a full body shot, and according to the research, in various states of undress. And of course, until recently, there was likely to be a woman in her pants on page 3 of The Sun from Monday through to Friday. Although now we've managed to get a bra on her, I think, so that's great. Anyway, so this focus on women's looks affects us beyond the usual lack of self-confidence that we usually talk about. There's a recent US study, which is quite worrying, which talks about how just mentioning a female politician's appearance, whether positive or negative or even neutral, so it could be something as simple as, you know, the minister was wearing a blue suit. It has been shown to have a detrimental effect on that woman's poll ratings, and voters were less likely to think she is experienced, strong, effective, qualified, and confident. And I would posit that's because we're so used to this. I mean, it's kind of like what happened with page 3. I don't know if you remember, they used to have this thing called news in briefs. And what it was you'd have the girl sort of standing there, you know, displaying herself, and next to it you'd have this really nasty, sarcastic little box, which was, you know, I can't think of a woman's name, Emma. Emma says that, you know, she thinks that nuclear proliferation is terrible because, as Bertrand Russell said, blah, 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 blah. And the idea was, lol, that's so funny, pretty women don't have brains, what are you talking about? She's never heard of Bertrand Russell, she doesn't even know what nuclear proliferation is. And I think it's a similar kind of thing, that when we're drawing attention to women's appearance, we sort of think, well, they can't be politicians then. So you've got this idea that a woman can be a politician so long as she's not sexually attractive. As soon as she's sexually attractive, she's a moron. But on the other hand, you can't you know, if you're not sexually attractive, you're also damned. So basically, women are sort of screwed either way. Anyway, moving on to Hollywood, where I'm sure you'll think it's much better. In Hollywood films, women make up only 28% of speaking roles and 17% of crowd scenes. And I'm sorry to keep banging on about this, but we are 50% of the population. And where you might think, well, okay, women aren't politicians and therefore maybe they would appear in the media less, there's just simply no reason that we wouldn't make up 50% of speaking roles in films which are fictional and about people's lives. Anyway. So anyway, the percentages of that haven't changed for the past 16 years. So again, don't believe people when they tell you, well, don't worry, it'll just carry on getting better if you just sort of shut up and put up with it. As an aside, what I find interesting about the latter stat, so the 17% stat, is that stat is one that I've noticed appearing quite frequently. So it is, I think it's the number of female surgeons in the US, and there are sort of various other groups. There's something about 17% that women seem to get stuck at. The other one that's interesting about 17% is that is the same percentage of women as it takes for when there's a mixed gender group. If it's 17% women, the men in the group have been shown to think that it's 50-50 men and women. And when it goes up to 33% women, the men in the group think that women are in the majority. So that possibly explains my little friend on the internet who told me women are everywhere. Okay, so what's going on here? Why is it that when women make up 51% of the population, do we represent that world as 70 to 80% male? You won't be surprised to know I have another theory about this, and to explain it, I want to introduce you to a concept called male default. So, here we have two frames that are exactly the same, except in the left-hand frame it's two men, and in the right-hand frame it's a man and a woman. So, as you can probably see, it's a sort of funny send-up of the double standard where men tend to be only expected to represent themselves as individuals, whereas women are seen as representatives from the planet woman, and we're all the same. So one woman can stand for all women. But actually, what I find particularly interesting about this cartoon is that it demonstrates how unthinkingly we accept the idea that male humans are the standard from which females deviate. So, for example, the standard stick figure is clearly the male one. We recognise that as the male standard stick figure. And it's when you add hair onto it, when you add something different onto it, that suddenly it becomes the female one. And most of us probably wouldn't really question that, because it's just so ingrained in us to think the standard one is male, and then you add a skirt on it, or you add some hair on it, and you make it a woman. But why is that? Why couldn't that just as equally, I mean, women wear trousers, women have human bodies. It's not like it's got a penis or something on it. Like, there's nothing to say that that's a man, you just accept that it's a man. Why couldn't we put like a beard on him or a tie or something to represent that he's a man, and then have the woman as the standard one? And the reason I think that's so interesting is that because this cartoon is attempting to make an anti-sexist point. Not only is it trying to make an anti-sexist point, it's trying to make the very point that it then goes on to sort of emphasise, which is that men are the default and that they aren't expected to just be representatives from planet woman, as I said. So I think that just shows how easy it is to fall into these sexist tropes, that even when we're trying to challenge sexism, we still regurgitate them. So let me show you some other examples of how this works. So as you can see, there is a Lego Time Teacher minifigure watch and clock, and a Lego Time Teacher girl minifigure watch and clock. And they're exactly the same, except one's pink and one's blue, and the boy one is obviously the blue one, but we don't need to mark that because that's the default, and the female one is the one that we add girl onto. Next, I don't know if you can read that. That's awesome girl and awesome kid. Girls are girls and boys are kids. That's self-explanatory, or well, I mean, it's not explanatory. I don't really know what's going on there, but you see the point I'm trying to make. This is one of my favourite things ever. So for all these years, we've been using Bic pens thinking that they were gender neutral. It turned out they were men Bic pens. And so we've got some girl Bic pens made for us, which are pink and glittery and very nice. The other Bic pens have not been renamed Bic for men. So that's very interesting. This is another story that I think it sort of took me aback really I have never really thought about the little green man. But he's a man, isn't he? He's a little bloody green man. And suddenly I realised, so this is a suffragette, this is in New Zealand. She was Kate Shepherd, and she was instrumental in New Zealand granting the vote to women, and they were the first country to grant votes to women, and so they honoured her by putting her there. But yeah, it just showed me again that here am I, this feminist who's obsessed with male default, goes around being angry at everything, like deodorant and women's deodorant. And it just hadn't occurred to me that every time I'm crossing the road, I'm thinking, oh, it's a little green man. Because we're just so used to seeing men as the default everywhere. So, I mean, the reason I'm sort of labouring this point is to say, don't worry if you do this. It doesn't mean you're a dreadful, awful person, but just, it's just important, I think, to try to be aware of it. Because, you know, we've been brought up this way. We've all been brought up in the same society. We're all sexist. We're all misogynistic. We all catch ourselves having these horrible thoughts. And the thing isn't to castigate ourselves and tell ourselves we're awful people. It's just to try and become aware of it and try and change it and try and educate other people about it. Anyway, so why does this matter? Well, it matters because it all adds up to a world where women are not seen as 50% of the human population, where you can have a world where it's seen as normal to have women only making up 28% of speaking roles. Because women aren't seen as normal humanity in the way that men are. They're seen as an anomaly, a deviation from standard humanity, which is represented by men. And this can have very serious consequences beyond, you know, being incredibly bored going to yet another film about a man discovering the world and changing it. And I don't know about you, but I'm really bored of that. Anyway, so I mean that was why I really liked Gone Girl actually, because although she was completely insane, it was one of the only films I've ever seen where a woman is completely in charge. Like, she was a total psychopath, but she was the best psychopath you've ever seen, and I really liked that. Anyway, so this can actually have very serious consequences. So until April last year, the vast majority of animals used by medical researchers in the US to develop new drugs and treatments were male. And that caused a whole host of problems, because the female body, contrary to what we may think, is not just a male body with some breasts and ovaries tacked on. It actually functions in some very different ways, right down to the cellular level. And by not testing drugs on female animals or women themselves as well, women have tended to have much more severe side effects and less effective treatment than men. So, for example, in 2013 in the US, the FDA had to tell women to cut their doses of a popular sleeping pill in half. So women had been taking twice the recommended dosage that they should have been taking, because it turned out that women metabolize the active ingredient 50% more slowly than men. Which is actually quite a big deal, you would think. Another example is statins, something that is regularly prescribed for both men and women, but again, that's only really being tested in men, and there's very little evidence to show that it has any positive impact on women. And so women are putting up with these side effects with potentially negligible benefits. Another quite dramatic example, I think, is heart attacks. So I think most people know what the symptom of a heart attack is. Do you know the symptom of a heart attack? Audience participation? I know we're English and we hate it, but come on.
Pain in your left arm, pain in your left arm, pain in your left arm,
Yeah.
pain in your chest.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that is the classic male heart attack symptom. And I also thought that that was what a female heart attack symptom is, but unfortunately it's different for women. And they tend to be more like indigestion, actually, for women. And there's plenty of evidence that plenty of doctors still, in fact, don't recognise when women present with a heart attack, and they diagnose them with pulled muscles or indigestion and send them home, which, as you can imagine, can be fatal. So this is actually there's another example. There was I read about this revolutionary new pacemaker, which has been introduced to the market. But it's been designed around the male body, so it only works for 20% of women, and I do wonder whether we would be hailing this revolutionary new pacemaker if it only worked for 20% of men. I think perhaps we describe it as unfit for purpose. So that's the medical side of things. There are other examples of the way this plays out to tangibly affect women. So, and this is a pretty awful one, I think. It's about female asylum seekers. So in 1951, the UN wrote this very beautiful, wonderful convention with great, their ideals were great. and it was meant to ensure that anyone who was being persecuted in their country would be given refuge and asylum in another country. So there are lots of things that these lovely people who drew up the convention said you could be persecuted for, and they include sexuality, political beliefs, religion, and social group. But what it does not include is gender. And if you speak to most female asylum seekers, the number one reason they give you for why you're being persecuted is because I'm a woman. Because I'm a woman, that is why I'm being threatened with FGM. Because I'm a woman, that's why I'm being forced into a marriage. Because I'm a woman, this is why I'm in an abusive relationship. Because I'm a woman, I'm being threatened with being killed because I want education. These are all reasons that women might want to leave the country that they're in. And we don't accept that as a legitimate reason for which someone can be persecuted. There are other issues as well. The type, so in order to claim asylum, you first have to be able to leave the country that you were originally in. This is much harder for women than for men, because women are often leaving from countries in which it is frowned upon or in fact illegal for women to travel on their own. They need to travel with a guardian, even though it might be the guardian that they're fleeing. And you know, I think a big part of the problem as well is this distinction between public and private, and there's this. I really urge you to read this fantastic article, which name I can't remember, but it's by Catherine McKinnon, and she's talking about, specifically about the rape camps in Bosnia, and she's talking about the way in which if something is done to a man and is done by the state, it is recognised as persecution, but because so often what's done to women is done by men that they know, or at least not by a state actor, it's not seen as persecution. So a woman can be kept prisoner in a house and beaten and sexually violated, and that's not seen as an abuse of her human rights, whereas if it happens to a man and it happens to be in a prison, and it's exactly the same thing, it's just in a prison, an actual prison, a state-sanctioned prison rather than a home, it's seen as an abuse of his human rights. So that's kind of what's going on there with the asylum seekers, the way that women can experience the same persecution as men, but because it's done by someone different, we don't accept it as persecution. So I just want to give you an example of how this can play out in reality. So for that book, in fact, I interviewed a woman called Nausea Atmar, who was a female politician in Afghanistan. And she was part of this wave of women voted in immediately after the Taliban were kicked out. And along with the other women in the parliament, they passed some really amazing progressive laws for women. And she was doing great stuff. Unfortunately, she didn't get voted in for a second term because of corruption. And just before that, she'd met a man, and she'd married this man, and this man had told her he was very supportive of her work, and he wanted to help her, and he was very proud to have this very liberated woman as his wife. As soon as she didn't get in for a second term, everything changed. She became a prisoner in her own home. He beat her, he raped her. Eventually, when he held a knife up to her throat, she realised that she had to try and escape. Her family told her that if she did leave him, they would kill her, and he also told her the same thing. She escaped to a refuge, one of the very few refuges they have in Afghanistan, because they are known as brothels. One of the ministers has denounced them as brothels. And she went to the British Embassy and said, please can you help me? And they said, we can't help you because domestic violence is a private matter, and in any case, if we did help you, it would open the floodgates. And it was perfectly legal for them to say that because they were right. Domestic violence is not a reason for which you can claim asylum. And they're also right that it would open the floodgates. But while they see that as a legitimate reason to not help these women, I see it as a very fundamental human rights abuse and an example of the way in which misogyny and the way in which women being seen as a deviation from normal humanity affects women on a day-to-day basis. And what's happening with Nausea now is that she's trying to claim asylum elsewhere, and she's finding that very difficult. And I think that she just is a very salutary lesson about what a mess the asylum system is when you've got a woman who was a member of parliament and was passing laws and was very educated, and she is not being granted asylum. What hope is there for a woman who has no education, who has no ability to leave the country, who has no money, who has no one to advocate for her? So, moving on, something slightly more lighthearted. Essentially, it's all a matter of perspective, and you can see what this is about. There's one woman there, and obviously she's the only person who thinks it's a sexist organisation, because men, bless them, sometimes find it hard to understand. Because why, really, why would you? I don't think that it's natural to be able to see the ways in which you're privileged. If I just turn off the microphone, I'm sorry, I'll just shout. I think it's natural not to be able to see the ways in which you're privileged if that's just what you're used to and no one's pointed it out to you. So I think it's really important that we don't, I just try to make it clear that I don't think that men are terrible because they're privileged, or terrible because they don't see it. They're only terrible when I tell them and then they don't see it. I just had an argument, a very big argument with a male friend of mine a couple of nights ago, and he was an arsehole. Anyway.
Glass of water, we'll try and get the microphone working, or you...
Well, I'm nearly finished, really.
Right.
I can just shout. So anyway, and when Lucia was in, I think I just unplugged it. I can just try and plug it back in. Hello? No. I just, I think the stand is male, and I just kicked it, yeah. So when Lucia was in Parliament in Afghanistan, violence against women became an issue that the government cared about, and our government seems to find it a minority issue. And the reason I pick up that picture, sorry, I've broken it. My female shoes. Oh, hello. I won't touch it again. So, yeah, the reason I show this picture is because they think that they have very cleverly disguised the huge number of men in the Parliament by putting all the women in their colourful dresses on the front row. Unfortunately, for those of us who prepared to look the second row and beyond, you can see that it's pretty much all men. And I do wonder if the reason that our government, in contrast to when Wazir was in government, thinks that violence against women is a minority issue, I do wonder if it's anything to do with the fact that so many of them are not women, and therefore haven't experienced what it's like to grow up in fear of male violence. And the fact that this government considers it a minor issue is made very clear by what Eva alluded to in the introduction, which is the cuts that are particularly impacting women, and particularly impacting women's services. So between 2010 and 2013, women's services were cut by 30%, and that's a figure that in fact rises to 47% for black and minority ethnic women. An example of that is that very recently in Islington, which has the only shelter for Latin American women in London, has had its funding cut, and they're currently trying to fight against that. But the government, in its wisdom, thinks that Latin American women who don't speak English don't need any particular special kind of support. So they think they can just be put in with all the other women, despite the fact that obviously women from Latin America face a very different kind of cultural misogyny and could do with experts in the field dealing with it. Anyway, but what is particularly galling about the fact that women's services are being cut at the moment is that in a time of austerity, as any women's services worker could tell you, demand for these services rises. And this has led to, for example, last year, on a single day last year, 180 women were turned away from a women's aid refuge. So if you multiply that by 365, to get the figure of how many women pretty much that year had to either go back to abusive partners or were made destitute and homeless, simply because our government does not consider it a matter of urgency to provide shelter for women who are being abused in their own homes. So I'm not saying that having more women represented in the media or more women in Hollywood would suddenly stop women being killed or cause governments to start shaping policies that prevent violence against women. And I'm not saying that it would suddenly stop this idea of women speaking out being shameful. But what I am saying is that a world that is designed uniquely around the male experience is demonstrably dangerous for women, and continually lets them down. And I suppose the other thing is, like what I was saying about why were these people sending me rape threats for something as minor as asking for a woman on a banknote, is that at the moment we are able to shame women for having desire and able to shame women for wanting to be in a position of power where they can speak up, where they can influence people, is because it's so rare. And when there are more women doing it, it's impossible to shame them because it just becomes something that's seen as part of the natural order of things. So the reason I think that female representation is an incredibly important topic for feminism is that I think it's incredibly important that women are fairly represented, as we are 51% of the population, and have our own specific needs, so that we're not represented as some niche interest group who can be regularly shut down with threats of rape and threats of violence, and who can be let down in their medical care, and who can be let down when they most need help and need to escape to a place of refuge. I firmly believe that having more women represented and more women in power and more women with the perspective of what it feels like and what it is like to be a woman in this world who are able to make laws is a very important way of changing that. And I hope you agree, and I hope that you will start campaigning for that as soon as you walk out the door. So thank you very much.
Okay, is there a microphone around?
Yeah, here.
Okay, who's got the first question? Over here. Arm up there.
In your opinion, what do you think we should be doing currently, if not like yesterday, to combat this problem?
Oh, that's a really horrible question to start off with. I think we need to do everything. You know, I don't think it's possible to pick out one aspect that needs changing, because everything needs changing. The entire structure is set up in the wrong way. And I think the way I sort of see feminism, excuse the sort of slightly tacky film reference, is I see it kind of like The Matrix. And that's certainly how it was for me, that I had never really understood feminism. I thought it was just a bunch of whiny women who were making us all look bad, and could they please just shut up. And as soon as it was explained to me in a way that I understood, funnily enough, it was reading a book called Feminism and Linguistic Theory. And the author was writing about how we think of, this is another great example of male default actually, how we think of grammar as ideologically neutral, but actually it isn't. So the way in which we say he or man to mean human, or he can mean any gender. And so grammar purists will tell you, well, it's fine to say he because everyone knows that it doesn't mean he. But actually they've done studies that show that when women hear he, even though it's meant to mean a genderless human, they think of a man, quite obviously, because that's the word for male human. And for me, suddenly feminism made sense, because when I read that I thought, God, that's true, that is what I think. And then I sort of thought, and actually, when I think of a doctor, I think of a man, and when I think of a lawyer, I think of a man, and when I think of a politician, I think of a man. And I suddenly realised that my entire imaginative world was populated by all these men. I am getting to your question. Anyway, and once I'd seen that, I did sort of start seeing it everywhere. And I really think that actually what needs to happen is that we need to have people within every single sphere working on changing that sphere. It's no good just having a bunch of feminists campaigning in this corner over there. We need to have people campaigning within engineering, within science, within politics, within medicine. So whatever field you're in, that's the one that you start campaigning. I mean, one of the women I interviewed for my book, she's this amazing explorer. She was the first woman to cross Antarctica on her own using just her own body power. The first person, in fact, to just use her own body power, the first woman to cross Antarctica on her own. And she'd never really thought about feminism or what she could do, and she said it's because she went to an all-girls school, and so she'd always been taught that she could do whatever she wanted, really, and she'd never encountered the idea that girls don't do maths and girls don't do all the things that girls who go to co-educational schools discover quite early on. So her first experience really of sexism was in the exploring world, where suddenly she was seen as this anomaly and people thought that she couldn't do stuff and she was given all the sort of girly jobs. And, you know, when she was trying to train certain men, like sort of older army type men, they would ask her junior male colleague to sort of back up what she had said. So she was really angry about this. And she thought, you know, what can I do? And she thought, well, the only thing that I know how to do is explore, so I'm going to lead a group of women on an exploration. And that was her way of trying to change this small part of the world that she occupied. So my very convoluted answer to you is I think that whatever part of the world it is that you're occupying, make that feminist, because the whole world is anti-feminist and we need to be campaigning in every single part of it. There's a question there and there and there. And lots of questions. What did I say?
I don't want to seem rude, but I have to walk out early. But I just passed my mind yesterday that we're in the United Kingdom. The Queendom for how many years?
We've had the Queen, did you say?
Yeah, well, the Queendom.
Yeah, but she's not really anything that anyone can aspire to, given that she's an inherited role, so that's not really...
Just that we're called kingdom, not queendom.
That's very true, good point. There you go.
Thank you. As a man, I find it horrifying as a lady came out of seeing it. But what about educating the children? I mean, at schools at the moment, Fire Brigade goes in and talks about fire safety. Police go into schools and talk about other forms of crime and crime prevention, the sex education. What about the programme where feminism, awareness of gender differences is promoted within schools?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I would love that. Maybe that could be your campaign. I mean, I do think it's incredibly important. You know, when I look back to my teenage years, I just think it would have been so much easier if I had known that feminism wasn't just a bunch of whiny women, and that it actually had relevance to my life, and that all the difficulties that I was experiencing, you know, basically as soon as my body became one that looked like a woman's body, it was no longer my own. From the age of 12, 13, suddenly my body was there for being grabbed and there for being followed and there for being commented on. And I really wish that I had known about feminism and known that this wasn't specific to me, that this was a political comment really by these boys, even though they didn't know that they were making a political comment. It was a political comment, it was a comment of their dominance over me. I wish that I'd known about feminism when I was 11 and realised that I was the only girl talking at the lunch table at school and I should shut up because it wasn't good to stand out in that way, and nobody liked that I was talking, especially the boys, and I knew that they had this power, although I didn't realise what it was about and I didn't recognise it as an unfair power. I intuitively recognised that they had this power, and so I needed to have them not hate me. And you know, there are so many stories like that girls will be able to tell you about when they started to intuitively recognise what their position in the world was. And certainly for me, I never questioned that position. I never questioned that boys could grab my body. I never questioned why they had more right to talk than I did. I just recognised that that's the way it was. And I do really wish that someone had taken me aside and told me, actually, you have just as much right to talk at the lunch table as the boys do. So, yeah, I think that would be fantastic, and I really hope that you are going to spearhead that campaign.
Hello. We often hear in the media or in campaigns that women are a small percentage of the boardroom. But what happens when those women try to climb the ladder to the boardroom and they are in the mid-30s, which is one of the highest productive, let's say, periods of their lives, but they are not having family or wish, of course, to have family, but actually they cannot proceed further higher because male-dominated businesses, unfortunately, think that they will have this gap. I mean, if they get married and have children, they will have a huge gap with maternity covers, and businesses actually do not want to give them, support them financially during those gap years. And so actually there's this huge discrimination So if you are in your mid-30s and you are qualified, you cannot go further or changing jobs because you are a woman, you happen to not having a family. You might want to have a family, but that should not be the reason to be stopped to move jobs or climbing the ladder higher. So I wish there was someone who would create this campaign and say no. We have to be equal when there is when businesses are recruiting women, because I also have noticed that maternity covers are only being covered by women for a year. Not this is what I've noticed. That was my question to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a really easy answer to that actually, which is do something about paternity leave, which is frankly a joke in this country. I think that men still get something like 2 weeks full pay, and that's it. And so it's built into our legislation that women are the primary caregivers, and that's clearly why women are discriminated against in a way that men aren't. So if men were given the same amount, if maternity and paternity leave were spread out equally, rather like they do in Sweden, they've got men have a certain amount, and if they don't take it, they lose it. So that's forced men to take it up. And the same thing happens to women. So there's a certain amount that is dedicated to the men, a certain amount that's dedicated to the women, and then there's a certain amount that they can share. And that's actually been amazing for changing the way in which care is done in Sweden. You actually do see, it's very usual to see men picking up their children from play school or pushing, you see a man, and in the way that we see two female friends walking down the road with a pushchair chatting in the park, you'll see two male friends walking down with a pushchair chatting in the park, which is a very rare sight in the UK. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that right from the start, men are not expected to care for their children in the same way that women are. There are plenty of men who really want to take on that role, but they can't take on that role because they can't afford to take off the unpaid leave. So I think that's a really, really important area to campaign on, actually. I think pushing for more men to be more involved in the unpaid care work. And I think there's a very interesting statistic about this, actually. So the figures for the OECD in 2012 show that they looked at heterosexual couples. So within the couple, if the man is the main earner, the woman does the vast majority of the care work, as you might expect. When it's a dual earner household, so they've both got full-time jobs, the woman is still doing the majority of the care work. And it's only when in a household where the woman is the main earner that they even pull equal. So this isn't the men are suddenly doing the majority of the care work when the woman's doing all the work outside of the home. The men are doing the same amount as the woman, only at the point where she's doing all the work outside of the home, like they're at home doing whatever it is that they do. So that's, I think, a very, very interesting illustration of the way in which unpaid care work is still very, very much seen as the woman's role, and that's something that really needs to be changed.
I just wanted to make a comment about the fact that I had a look at McCoy's crisps recently, and on the back it said man-sized crisps, man crisps. And I wanted to post a picture on Facebook and say, women's crisps, and it's totally unnecessary, and it's that kind of subliminal advertising that comes at you all the time, and I suppose a lot of people don't notice it, but really it's totally unnecessary and really inappropriate, and it shouldn't be allowed, actually. What's someone's sex got to do with a packet of crisps? Really?
I can't argue with that. Yeah, I mean, it's part of this idea of how masculinity is constructed, and I think that's a really important area for feminism to counter, because masculinity isn't good for anyone. It's men make up, I think something like 90% of those who commit violent sexual crimes and like 84% of those who commit violent crimes. There's a much higher suicide rate amongst men. They are more likely to attack each other and also obviously to attack women. It's a real problem, this idea that you're only a quote-unquote real man if you can eat big boy crisps. And it starts from so early on, the idea that big boys don't cry. I don't know, I'm sure you will have seen fathers with their sons, taking the doll away from the son, or saying, you can't have that because it's pink. And it just starts so soon that boys are pushed into this role of being completely emotionless and being dominant and being masculine in this kind of very macho way. And it's damaging for men's psyches, I firmly believe, and also it's damaging for women because we bear the brunt of it as a result of the male violence that results from boys being told that this is the way they have to behave. And people might think that it's innate, but if you look at, there's this study that I just find absolutely fascinating and also incredibly depressing. So it's done on babies, and they looked at the behaviour of the babies in terms, so there's 3 types of behaviour. One was sort of communicative, so sort of babbling and trying to sort of engage with their caregiver. And then there was sort of quite the sort of aggressive type of behaviour, so like pulling on their caregiver and sort of maybe lashing at them. And there was also another type of behaviour which was sort of screaming and crying out and sort of quite vocally demanding attention. And they couldn't tell any difference between the male and the female. They were exactly the same, displayed the exactly same level of all of these types of behaviours. But the difference was in the way in which the caregivers responded to the babies, depending on whether they were male or female. So the female babies got responded to at a much higher rate than the male babies to the communicative behaviours, so the babbling and the sort of laughing. There was a much higher response rate for the female babies. And that completely switched around when it was the more aggressive behaviours, so the crying and the sort of grabbing and the lashing out. The boys got a much higher response rate than the girls. And they went back to visit these babies a year later, and as you might expect, the boys had started pretty much only doing the aggressive behaviours, and the girls were much more communicative with their caregivers and doing lots of babbling. And you see that as, you see how that carries on as we go into adulthood, and women are sort of seen as, oh, but you're just so much better with emotions, and you're just really communicative, and so we're going to put you in reception. And and the men are given this sort of aggressive sales role, because you go in there and you're a man, you get what you want, you get out. And it's all down to the way we treat babies when they're born. I can't even remember what the question was. Crisps, yeah. There you go, ban crisps.
Add it to your list.
Hi, I'm just wondering your thoughts on sort of representation of women in business and things with in terms of quotas, if you think that's a good idea, or does that undermine women getting onto board?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing about quotas is that they've been framed in a very unfortunate way. So we use this term positive discrimination. And well, actually, we've already got positive discrimination going on, and it's been going on for millennia. The only thing is, it's in favour of men. And this is. Sorry, distracted by the opera. You can only argue against the idea that we currently have discrimination in favour of men going on if you genuinely think that women are less competent than men. We've had women having access to education for long enough now that women should be reaching the higher echelons of business and politics and journalism. And people often make this argument, oh, well, got to employ people on merit. Surely you only want the best person for the job. And I would point those people towards Chris Grayling and ask you whether you really think that the Justice Secretary really is the best person for the job. Bearing in mind he's been taken to court more times than any Justice Secretary in living memory, or perhaps ever, because he keeps acting in an unlawful way. He's the Justice Secretary. So, yeah, I don't think that people are being employed on merit. There's plenty of evidence to demonstrate that people employ people who are like them, and examples of this. And also that people actually actively discriminate against women. So there was a study where a load of CVs were sent out for science posts, and the CVs were exactly the same, except one had a male name, one had a female name. And the one with the female name was much less likely to get the post, and also to be given a lower salary than the one with the male name. Interestingly, in the field of music, they've started doing these gender-blind auditions, so they'll do an audition behind a screen so that the auditioners can't see the gender of the person who's playing violin or whatever. And it used to be that men were much more likely to be hired for orchestras, and actually that's become pretty equal now, simply as a result of putting a screen up. Sorry, quotas. Yeah, so quotas I think are potentially a necessary evil, unless someone else can come up with a better. So I mean, I think that putting people in front of a screen is a great idea, because that way you get the gender equality without having to put this enforced quota on, which people are suspicious of. And there is some evidence to suggest that people who are hired as a result of a quota have to work extra hard to prove that they're there not just because of the quota. And some women don't like being there as a result of a quota because they feel that people will look down on them. So there are these problems, and it's a blunt instrument, and it's not great. But on the other hand, no one else has come up with a better solution, and we do need a solution, because ultimately this needs to change, and it's not changing on its own. So my position on quotas is that they might be a necessary evil in the short term, just so that people can get used to women being in these positions of power.
Mine's not really a question. I hope I don't sound too obnoxious, but when we were talking about parental leave, the law's actually changing this April, so it's just a bit of a success, because parents can now, men and women can now share 12 months of parental leave. So like you say, it's moving much towards the Swedish model, although it's not that they'll lose it if they don't use it, unfortunately. But yeah, I just thought that was a little bit, because I work in HR, and I got really excited about this, and everybody else was just like, oh, paperwork. But I got really excited about it. So,
that is great.
Yeah, I just wanted to little success there.
I thought it had been changing, but then it hadn't. Anyway, so that's great to know. Unfortunately, I'm sceptical about how much men will be taking it up, because they don't tend to.
No.
Is the reality from various places where this has happened. You kind of have to push them towards it, because of this cultural idea that it's women who do the majority of care work.
Yeah, I think my brother, when his first child was born, took his 2 weeks off, and they were calling him after 4 days to come back. So,
right.
You know, just never dreamed of doing that to a woman. But
yeah, unfortunately. Surely that's illegal.
Well, it is for women, because women have to take 2 weeks off, but men don't have to take the paternity off.
Any more questions?
Sure, I wanted to points again as well. The idea of quotas is a great thing. I've heard somebody say we've got this issue of having all female shortlists, but just all the rest of the time we've had all male shortlists. It's just the way it is. And going back to the first point about sort of what we can do for a really small thing, one of my friends has an amazing example that she works for a bank, and they finished this engagement, we were writing a letter to the board to thank them for this engagement, and they addressed the letter to Dear Sirs. And she went and said, this is wrong, there's a woman on this board, it's not Dear Sirs. And everyone in the team went, but people have signed this now, you know, it doesn't really matter. And she's like, well, no, this does matter. It's then not Dear Sirs, it's a woman, why are we ignoring this? You know, she went around, she had to go around every single member of her team and convince them that this was a good idea to go back and get these signatures changed. She won, she got it done. And it's a small thing, but now, every time these letters get sent around, people are going to realise that, you know, there's either no women on boards or it's not many of them. And they're going to realise actually they've got to think about this every time, which I think is a small thing, but starting to make people think about that, it's quite a tangible thing we can all do to make a difference.
I think that's absolutely brilliant. And if your sister was, did you say your sister or your friend? Your friend was here. I'd give her a round of applause. And I, you know, you sort of say it's a small thing, like that somehow diminishes it, but every change comes from small things happening. We can't, you know, imagine starting a petition saying end patriarchy. You can't do that, because it's made up of all these tiny little things like that, all these tiny little instances. And so that's really what everyone has to do. There are so many, there will be, you know, hundreds of things that happen through your day that you could say, I don't, you know, I'm not going to do that, and or you could change that. You know, for example, the men in the room, perhaps you're in a meeting and you notice that a woman has said something and no one's listened to it, and then a man has said it exactly the same thing, the idea has been taken up. This is so prevalent that cartoons have been made about it. I'm not just making this up. So if you're a man and you're in that meeting, perhaps you could say, oh, but that's what she just said 10 minutes ago. There are so many little instances that if you just be alert for, that you can pick up on, and it can make a really big difference. So, and if everyone does it, then, you know, patriarchy will be over in like 10 minutes. That'd be great. I think that's it, isn't it?
Okay, I think that's... I just want to thank Caroline very much for doing exactly what Penny Lectures are designed to do, to make us think. I'm one of those whinging, I think, feminists from the 80s. I'd like a debate about that, actually. However, I'm not whinging, no. But something obviously went wrong. Caroline's book is here. Do come along and have a look, and it's for sale. So, and she'll sign copies for you.
I will, if anyone wants me to, yeah.